The Eternal Conqueror, the epic saga of Genghis Khan. Opening, the Sacred Mountain. Telecommunications, Khaldun like the breath of gods, carrying with it the scent of pine and the whisper of ancient spirits. Snow dusted the sacred mountain's peaks, while below, in the shadow of its eternal presence, the endless grasslands of Mongolia stretched toward horizons that seemed to touch the sky itself. Here, where earth met heaven, where nomadic clans had wandered for countless generations, a child would be born who would reshape the very fabric of human civilization. The year was 1162, though the exact date remains lost to the mists of time. In this land where the sky dominated everything, where survival depended on the strength of your horse and the sharpness of your blade, a woman named Hoelun prepared to give birth. The labor came hard, as all things came hard on these wind-swept plains. Outside the felt tent, warriors stood watch, while the Mongol chieftain Yasuge paced with the restless energy of a man who understood that sons meant survival and daughters meant alliances. When the child finally emerged into the cold air of the steppe, the attending women gasped. The infant boy clutched in his tiny fist a clot of blood, dark and ominous. According to Mongol tradition, this was a sign, an omen written in flesh and blood. The child was destined to become a great warrior, a conqueror whose name would echo through the ages. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently defeated in battle, as was the custom to commemorate victories and intimidate enemies. Flushed, but destiny is a cruel teacher, and the path to greatness is paved with suffering that would break lesser souls. The infant who would one day be called Genghis Khan had no way of knowing that within 9 short years his entire world would collapse, leaving him to fight for survival in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. 1. Born in blood and shadow. Temujin's early years unfolded against the backdrop of the Central Asian steppe, a vast ocean of grass where life moved with the seasons and survival depended on the strength of tribal bonds. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, part of the larger Mongol confederation. The Borjigins claimed descent from Bodonchar Munkag, a legendary warlord, and through this lineage, Yasuge possessed enough status to command respect, though not enough to guarantee safety. The boy's mother, Hoelun, came from the Olkonud tribe. Her marriage to Yasuge had itself been born of violence, as Yasuge had abducted her from a Merkit tribesman named Chilidu on her wedding day, a common practice among the steppe peoples that would later return to haunt their son. This act planted seeds of vengeance that would sprout years later with terrible consequences. Young Temujin grew up learning the essential skills of nomadic life. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, spending hours on horseback as his small hands gripped the reins and his legs learned to move with the animal's rhythm. He learned to shoot arrows from horseback, mastering the composite bow that made Mongol warriors so deadly. He learned to track animals across the grasslands, to read the weather in the clouds, to find water where others saw only endless grass. Most importantly, he learned that on the steppe, strength was everything. The strong survived, prospered, and passed on their bloodlines. The weak perished, forgotten like dust scattered by the wind. Also learned softer lessons from his mother. Hoelun was a woman of remarkable intelligence and strength, and she taught her son about the value of alliances, about reading people's intentions, about thinking several moves ahead, like a master player of a game where the stakes were life and death. These lessons, learned at her knee while winter winds battered their felt tent, would prove more valuable than any skill with bow or blade. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father, Yasuge, decided it was time to secure his son's future through marriage. In the world of Mongol politics, marriages were tools for forging alliances between clans. Yasuge had remembered an old agreement with a leader named Day Sechen of the Ongirat tribe, who had a daughter named Burta. The arrangement had been made years earlier, and now Yasuge would honor it. Father and son traveled together across the grasslands toward the Ongarat territory. For young Temujin, it was an adventure, a chance to ride beside his father and feel like a warrior. They talked of many things during those days on horseback, and Yasuge shared wisdom about leadership, about the importance of keeping your word, about how a man's honor was more valuable than gold. When they finally reached the Ongarat encampment, Day-Sechen welcomed them warmly. His daughter, Borta, was a year older than Temujin, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested strength of character. The two children regarded each other with the frank curiosity of youth, neither knowing that their fates would become intertwined in ways that would test them beyond imagining. Following custom, young Temujin would remain with Borta's family for a time to work and prove his worth. This was traditional among the Mongols, a way for the bride's family to evaluate the character of their future son-in-law. Yasuge prepared to depart, confident that his son's future was secure. He embraced Temujin, gave him final words of counsel, and rode away across the grasslands. The chieftain's mind was light, his heart unburdened, believing he had done his duty by his son. But the steppe has a way of punishing such complacency. On his journey home, Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars. The Tatars and Mongols had been enemies for generations, locked in cycles of raid and counter-raid, of blood feuds that stretched back beyond living memory. But these Tatars appeared friendly, inviting Yasuge to share a meal with them, to rest and eat before continuing his journey. Perhaps Yasuge was tired. Perhaps he was too trusting. Perhaps he simply failed to recognize his enemies until too late. The Tatars knew exactly who Yasuge was. They remembered the defeats he had handed them, remembered the Tatar chieftain he had killed, the child named after that very chieftain now growing up in a distant camp. They offered food and drink, and Yasuge accepted. The poison was subtle, working slowly so that Yasuge would not suspect until he was far from their camp, until it was too late for revenge or justice. 2. The orphan's trial. When word reached young Temujin that his father had been poisoned by the Tatars and was dying, the boy rushed home with desperate speed. But he arrived too late. Yasuge had succumbed to the poison, dying in agony, his final moments spent calling out instructions to messengers, urging his clan to remain united, to protect his family. But death has a way of revealing the true nature of loyalty, and Yasuge's death exposed how fragile his position had been. The Taichiud clan, rivals within the larger Mongol confederation, saw opportunity in Yasuge's death. They had long resented the Borjigin clan's status, and now, with the strong chieftain gone, they moved swiftly to consolidate power. The new leader of the Taichiuds, Tagutai, declared that he would not follow a boy chieftain. One by one, the families that had pledged loyalty to Yasuge packed their belongings, struck their tents, and rode away to join Tagutai's camp. Hoelun, watching her world collapse, made a desperate attempt to hold the clan together. According to the secret history of the Mongols, she grabbed the clan's banner and rode after the departing families, pleading with them to remember their oaths, to honor the memory of her husband. But the steppe recognizes only strength, and a widow with young children had none. The families continued riding away, leaving Hoelun, Temujin, his siblings, and a few loyal retainers alone on the vast grasslands. The years that followed were a crucible of suffering that would have destroyed most people. The family that had once enjoyed the protection and prestige of a chieftain's household now faced starvation. They survived on wild fruits, roots, and whatever small game Temujin and his brothers could hunt. They caught fish in the rivers, dug for edible plants, lived like animals rather than people. The hardships carved away everything soft from young Temujin's character, leaving only what was hard and necessary. But even in this desperate situation, conflict found them. Temujin had a half-brother named Bekta, son of one of Yasuge's other wives, and as resources grew scarcer, tensions within the family escalated. The breaking point came when Bekta took food that Temujin and his full brother Kasar had caught, an act of theft that in their starving condition felt like attempted murder. Temujin, approximately 13 years old at this time, made a decision that would haunt him but also defined him. He and Qasar tracked Bekta and shot him with arrows, killing their half-brother. Their mother Hoelun was furious, horrified by what her sons had done, raging at them for killing their own blood. But Temujin had learned a harsh lesson that the steppe had been teaching him since his father's death. In a world without law, you took what you needed, or you died. Mercy was a luxury for the strong, and they were anything but strong. The murder of Bekta did not go unnoticed. The Taichiuds, perhaps fearing that Temujin was becoming dangerous despite his youth, decided to eliminate the potential threat. They raided the family's camp and captured Temujin. For several months, the teenage boy was held prisoner, forced to wear a wooden kang around his neck, a portable restraint that prevented him from using his hands freely. He was paraded from camp to camp, displayed as a warning to others who might challenge Taichiud authority. But Temujin's will had not been broken by starvation, and it would not be broken by captivity. On the night of a celebration, when his guards were drunk and distracted, Temujin seized his moment. He struck one guard with the heavy wooden kang, stunning him, and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerged with only his face above water, while Taichiud warriors searched the banks with torches. As he lay there in the cold water, certain that discovery meant death, a man named Sorkan Shira found him. Sorkan was from the Taichiud clan and should have called out to the other searchers. Instead, he looked at the desperate teenager, saw something in his eyes, and made a choice that would echo through history. He told Temujin to stay hidden and quiet, then walked away without raising the alarm. When the search parties finally gave up and returned to their celebrations, Sorkan helped Temujin remove the kang, gave him food, and told him to flee. Years later, when Temujin had become Genghis Khan and commanded armies that made the earth tremble, he would remember Sorkan Shira's mercy. He would elevate Sorkan's entire family, making them honored members of his guard, repaying a debt that went beyond words. But in that moment, hiding by the river, Temujin was just a teenage fugitive who had learned another crucial lesson. Even in the darkest moments, there are those who will choose compassion over cruelty, and those individuals are worth remembering. Temujin returned to his family, and slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. He started to attract followers, young men who saw something in this scarred, hardened teenager that inspired loyalty. Some, like Jelme and Boorchu, would remain at his side for life, becoming generals who would help him conquer half the known world. But that future was still distant. For now, Temujin focused on survival, on building strength, and on remembering those who had wronged him. 3. The forging of steel. As Temujin matured into young manhood, around the age of 16, he remembered the marriage arrangement his father had made with Day Sechen. Tradition and practical necessity both demanded that he honor this agreement. A wife meant the possibility of sons, of continuing his bloodline. A wife from the Ongerat tribe meant an alliance, a connection to a powerful clan that could provide support against enemies. Temujin traveled to the Ongerat lands and claimed Borta as his bride. The reunion was significant beyond mere custom. Borta's father, perhaps impressed by the young man's survival and determination, gave them a valuable wedding gift, a black sable coat of surpassing quality, the kind of garment that could be traded for horses, weapons, or political favors. This coat would soon play a crucial role in Temujin's rise to power. The young couple established their own camp, but their happiness was short-lived. The Merkits, the same tribe from which Yesuge had abducted Hoelun years earlier, had not forgotten that insult. They came in the night, a raiding party bent on revenge through the ancient custom of taking a woman for a woman. Temujin managed to escape with his brothers and mother, but Borta was captured and given to a Merkit warrior as his wife. Karnujin, This was catastrophic on multiple levels. The loss of Borta was personal, a wound to his heart. But it was also political. A man who could not protect his own wife would never command respect on the steppe. And it was strategic. The Merkits had made him look weak before he had even begun to establish power. He needed help, and he needed it from someone with real military strength. Temujin took his sable coat and rode to find Togrul, the Khan of the Karaite tribe. Togrul had been an ally of Yesuge, bound to him by an oath of brotherhood, and when Temujin presented the valuable coat and asked for help recovering his wife, Togrul agreed. The older leader provided 20,000 warriors for the mission, an army large enough to crush the Merkits decisively. But Temujin also sought help from an old childhood friend named Jamuka, a charismatic leader who commanded his own followers. Jamuka agreed to join the campaign, bringing additional warriors. Together, the three forces descended on the Merkit camps in a devastating surprise attack. The raid was brutally effective. The Merkits were scattered, many were killed, and Borta was recovered. When Temujin was reunited with his wife, she was pregnant. She gave birth to a son 9 months later, a boy they named Jochi, which some scholars suggest means visitor or guest. The circumstances of his conception would forever cast doubt on his paternity. Was Jochi the son of Temujin, conceived before the kidnapping, or was he the son of the Merkit warrior who had taken Borta? This question would poison relationships within Temujin's family for decades, but Temujin himself publicly acknowledged Jochi as his son and treated him as his legitimate heir. The successful rescue of Borta brought Temujin significant prestige among the tribes. He had demonstrated that he could gather allies, plan military operations, and execute them successfully. More young warriors began to drift into his camp, attracted by his reputation and by something harder to define, a quality of leadership that inspired men to follow him into danger. Over the next several years, Temujin and Jamuka fought side by side, their friendship deepening as they shared victories and hardships. They even performed the traditional ceremony of Anda, becoming sworn blood brothers. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Temujin was becoming too popular, attracting warriors who might otherwise have followed Jamuka. More fundamentally, the two men had different visions of leadership. Jamuka believed in the traditional aristocratic system where birth determined status. Temujin, who had grown up outside that system and had suffered under it, believed in promoting men based on merit and loyalty rather than bloodline. The breaking point came gradually. Some sources suggest that Jamuka's treatment of prisoners was unnecessarily cruel, boiling 70 young men alive in retaliation for some offense, an act that horrified even by the brutal standards of the steppe. Others suggest that political calculations drove the two apart, as their ambitions became incompatible. Whatever the exact cause, by 1187, Temujin and Jamuka were no longer allies, but rivals, competing for supremacy over the Mongol tribes. The two forces met at a place called Dalan Baljut. Jamuka, commanding larger numbers and with more experience, defeated Temujin decisively. The battle could have ended Temujin's ambitions permanently, but instead of capturing or killing his former friend, Jamuka's harsh treatment of prisoners after the battle drove some of his own followers to defect to Temujin's camp. Cruelty had undermined victory, a lesson Temujin stored away for future use. The defeat at Dalan Baljut forced Temujin into a period of obscurity. Some historians believe he may have spent several years as a subject or servant of the Jin dynasty in northern China, though this remains debated. What is certain is that he re-emerged around 1195, stronger and more politically sophisticated. He had learned patience, strategy, and the value of building coalitions. He had also learned from his defeat, understanding that battles were won as much through preparation and planning as through courage on the battlefield. 4. The rising storm. Turbulence. By the late 1190s, the political landscape of the Mongolian steppe was fragmenting into competing power centers. The Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Kerates, and various Mongol tribes all vied for dominance, their shifting alliances creating a complex web of temporary friendships and permanent feuds. Into this chaos, Temujin began his systematic campaign to unite all the tribes under his leadership. His strategy was methodical and ruthless. He would ally with the stronger against the weaker, then turn on his former allies when they became the weaker party. He formed a crucial partnership with Togrul of the Kerates, the same leader who had helped him rescue Borta years earlier. Together, they launched campaigns against the Tatars, the tribe responsible for poisoning Yesuge. Contingent against the Tatars was particularly brutal, driven by Temujin's need for revenge and his understanding that the Tatars, if left intact, would forever be a threat. When Temujin captured Tatar settlements, he ordered that all men taller than the height of a cart axle be killed. This left only young children alive, children who could be adopted into Mongol families and raised as Mongols, effectively erasing the Tatar identity. It was genocide by another name, but it was also pragmatic. Temujin was eliminating an entire people who had blood feuds with his own. But as Temujin's power grew, his relationship with Togrul deteriorated. The Kerate Khan had grown old and suspicious, and his son Sengum resented Temujin's increasing influence. Tensions escalated until Sengum attempted to ambush and kill Temujin at what was supposed to be a peaceful feast. Warned at the last moment by sympathizers within Togrul's camp, Temujin escaped the trap, but barely. This betrayal forced Temujin into temporary exile with only a handful of loyal followers. It was perhaps the darkest moment since his father's death, a period when his entire enterprise seemed on the verge of collapse. But Temujin had learned from years of hardship that survival often came down to maintaining morale and projecting confidence even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He gathered his small band of followers and swore an oath that they would share both victory and defeat together, that their loyalty would be rewarded beyond measure when fortune turned. Fortune did turn. Warriors who had fled to other tribes after the failed ambush began to return, bringing news of discontent in the camps of Temujin's enemies. Togrul's betrayal had been seen as dishonorable by many, and Temujin's reputation for rewarding loyalty and treating followers fairly was attracting defectors. Within months, Temujin had rebuilt his forces and was ready to strike back. Photographic with the Kerates was swift and decisive. Temujin's warriors fell upon Togrul's camps in a series of lightning strikes that scattered the Kerate Confederation. Togrul himself fled westward and was killed by Naiman's scouts, did not recognize the old Khan. Temujin absorbed the Kerate warriors into his own forces, treating those who submitted with respect while eliminating those who resisted. The Kerate nation ceased to exist as an independent entity, its people becoming Mongols. Next came the Naimans, a powerful confederation in western Mongolia led by Taiyang Khan. The Naimans represented the last significant force standing between Temujin and complete control of the Mongol tribes. Jamuka, Temujin's old friend turned bitter enemy, had found refuge with the Naimans, and he urged Taiyang Khan to attack before Temujin could grow stronger. The decisive battle took place in 1204 at Chakirmaut in the Altai Mountains. Temujin deployed his forces with strategic brilliance, using the terrain to negate the Naiman numerical advantage. When Taiyang Khan was wounded in battle, the Naiman resolve collapsed. Taiyang died of his wounds, and his son Kuchlug fled westward. The Naiman warriors were offered the same choice as all of Temujin's defeated enemies: join him or die. Most chose to join. But what of Jamuka, the old friend who had become the old enemy? After the Naiman defeat, Jamuka's own followers, recognizing that his cause was hopeless, betrayed him to Temujin. They brought him bound in chains, expecting reward. Instead, Temujin had them executed on the spot for betraying their own leader, a powerful statement about the importance of loyalty. Flushing came the final confrontation between the two men who had once called each other blood brothers. According to the secret history, Jamuka acknowledged that his time had come, but asked to die in a specific way, without having his blood spilled, a dignified death by having his back broken. Some sources claim Temujin honored this request as a final gesture of respect for their old friendship. Others suggest Jamuka was executed in a more conventional manner. Either way, the last significant rival to Temujin's supremacy was removed. By 1206, Temujin controlled all the major Mongol tribes and many neighboring peoples. That year, a great Kurultai, a gathering of tribal leaders, was held at the source of the Onon River, near where Temujin had been born 44 years earlier. There, in a ceremony witnessed by tens of thousands of warriors, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title whose meaning remains debated, but is generally understood to mean universal ruler or oceanic sovereign. The man who had grown up an orphan, who had starved and suffered and fought for every scrap of power, now commanded an army of over 100,000 warriors united under a single banner. He had created something unprecedented, a true Mongol nation rather than a collection of feuding tribes. But Genghis Khan understood that unity required more than military victory. It required a system, laws, and a vision that extended beyond merely raiding and plundering. He created the Yasa, a code of laws that bound all Mongols together. The Yasa covered everything from military discipline to inheritance rights, from the prohibition of theft to the treatment of prisoners. It mandated religious tolerance, protecting all faiths within the empire. It promoted individuals based on merit rather than birth, allowing talented commoners to rise to positions of command. It centralized the distribution of spoils from conquests, preventing the kind of internal conflicts that had weakened previous steppe confederations. Genghis Khan also adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian, commissioning scribes to create written records and communications. This was revolutionary. The Mongols had been an oral culture, and now they would have the ability to maintain detailed records, to send written orders across vast distances, to preserve their history for future generations. But laws and literacy were tools for internal governance. For external relations, Genghis Khan needed conquests that would bring wealth, prestige, and security to his newly united people. He looked around at his neighbors and made his decision. He would strike at the civilizations that had long treated the steppe nomads with contempt, the wealthy kingdoms that had gold, silk, and grain in abundance, while the Mongols struggled with poverty. He would show them that the balance of power was shifting, that a new force had risen in the world. 5. The Dragon's Wrath. Killing to the south of Mongolia lay the Western Xia dynasty, also called the Tanguts, controlling territory in what is now Gansu, Ningxia, and parts of Shanxi and Qinghai. Beyond them, controlling northern China down to the Yangtze River, was the Jin dynasty, established by the Jurchen people from Manchuria. These were the same Jin who had allied with the Tatars to kill Genghis Khan's grandfather, Ambagai, decades earlier, nailing him to a wooden donkey and leaving him to die in agony. The Mongols had long memories for such grievances. In 1209, Genghis Khan launched his first major campaign against a settled civilization, targeting Western Xia. The Tanguts had developed a sophisticated military system and possessed well-fortified cities, advantages that should have protected them against nomadic raiders. But Genghis Khan was not conducting a raid. This was conquest, methodical and relentless. Mongols struggled initially with siege warfare. Nomadic warriors excelled at mobile combat, at riding and shooting, at the fluid tactics of the steppe. But thick walls and defensive fortifications were new challenges. Genghis Khan, displaying the adaptability that characterized his entire career, began recruiting Chinese siege engineers and learning from them. The Mongols adopted catapults, siege towers, and other technologies, integrating them into their military system. After several years of campaigning, Western Xia sued for peace. The Tangut emperor agreed to become a vassal state, paying tribute to the Mongols and providing military support when requested. Genghis Khan accepted this arrangement, not out of mercy, but out of pragmatism. A vassal state that provided tribute and soldiers was more valuable than a devastated wasteland. He had achieved his goal of securing his southern flank and demonstrating that the Mongols could defeat settled civilizations. With Western Xia neutralized, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin dynasty. This was personal as well as political. The Jin had supported the Tatars against the Mongols for decades, manipulating the steppe tribes to keep them weak and divided. Now the Khan would extract payment for those policies. The campaign against the Jin began in 1211 and would continue for decades, eventually concluded by Genghis Khan's successors. The Mongols invaded from the north in 3 massive columns, with Genghis Khan personally leading the center. The Jin had approximately 600,000 troops, outnumbering the Mongol invasion force, but they made a fatal strategic error. They divided their army to defend multiple locations, rather than concentrating for a decisive battle. Jin territory devastated the Jil territory systematically, employing psychological force. The Mongols made examples of them through systematic destruction and mass executions, word of which would spread and terrify other cities into surrendering without a fight. When cities surrendered quickly, the Mongols were comparatively merciful, sparing much of the population and merely taking tribute. By 1213, the Mongols had reached the Great Wall, that ancient barrier built to keep northern barbarians from Chinese wealth. The wall proved no obstacle. The Mongols found passes and bribed garrison commanders, demonstrating that fixed fortifications were only as strong as the men defending them. They swept into the regions beyond, pillaging the countryside and besieging cities. The Jin capital of Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, held out for over 2 years. The siege demonstrated both the Mongols' growing sophistication in siege warfare and their ruthless determination. They diverted rivers, built siege engines, and relentlessly assaulted the walls while cutting off all supplies. When the city finally fell in 1215, the Mongols sacked it thoroughly. The contemporary accounts describe mountains of bones, burnt ruins, and a city transformed from one of the world's great metropolises into a devastated shell. But even as one capital burned, the Jin dynasty did not collapse entirely. The Jin court moved its capital south to Kaifeng and continued to resist. Genghis Khan recognized that completely conquering the Jin would require years of effort and would tie down his armies in garrison duties across vast territories. He had proven his point. The Mongols were the dominant military power. Now he would secure the north and turn his attention westward, where new opportunities and new enemies awaited. Throughout these campaigns, Genghis Khan was learning lessons that would make his armies nearly invincible. He organized his forces in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with clear chains of command and excellent communication through mounted messengers. He employed scouts extensively, gathering intelligence about enemy movements, terrain, and resources. He used psychological warfare, allowing survivors of massacres to escape and spread terrifying stories about Mongol cruelty, which encouraged other cities to surrender rather than resist. Most significantly, Genghis Khan was willing to learn from his enemies and adopt their technologies. Chinese engineers taught the Mongols siege warfare. Muslim scholars shared knowledge about distant lands. Literate scribes from conquered peoples joined the Mongol administration, bringing organizational skills that a nomadic society had never needed. The Mongol Empire was becoming more than a military force. It was evolving into a political entity capable of governing diverse peoples across vast distances. 6. The Otrar Massacre. While the campaigns in China continued under his generals, Genghis Khan's attention was drawn westward to the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy realm controlling much of Central Asia, including modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and parts of Pakistan and Kazakhstan. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, ruled over prosperous cities along the Silk Road, places with names that sang of exotic wealth: Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Gurganj. Genghis Khan initially had no intention of conquering Khwarezm. His armies were already stretched fighting the Jinn, and a war on two fronts would be strategically unwise. Instead, he sent a trade caravan of approximately 450 merchants to establish commercial relations. The caravan was loaded with goods intended to impress: silk, furs, precious metals. Leading it were 3 ambassadors, including 2 Mongols and 1 Muslim. This was meant to be a gesture of peace, an opening of trade routes that would benefit both empires. Keklad after Otrar, a border city in Khwarezmian territory, in 1218. The governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk, also known as Gerbey, who held the honorific title of Khoja. Inalchuk examined the caravan and made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for his entire empire. He accused the merchants of being spies, confiscated all their goods, and executed the entire caravan. When news reached Genghis Khan, he was faced with an intolerable insult. In Mongol culture, merchants were sacrosanct, and ambassadors even more so. The execution of the caravan was not merely murder, it was a declaration that the Khwarezmian Empire held the Mongols in contempt. But Genghis Khan, displaying uncharacteristic restraint, sent another embassy directly to Shah Muhammad, consisting of 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols. The message was clear: hand over Inalchuk for punishment, compensate for the losses, and this matter can be resolved peacefully. Shah Muhammad's response sealed his empire's fate. Instead of accepting the reasonable demand, he had the Muslim ambassador beheaded and the 2 Mongol ambassadors publicly humiliated by having their beards shaved before sending them back to Genghis Khan. This was an even more profound insult than the first. By executing 1 ambassador and humiliating the others, the Shah was making a statement. He did not fear the Mongols, he would not negotiate with them, and he expected them to accept this treatment. Genghis Khan's reaction, according to multiple sources, was to climb to the top of a mountain alone and spend 3 days and nights in prayer to the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of Mongol shamanism. When he descended, his decision was made. He would abandon the war with Jin, leaving it in the hands of capable generals. He would gather every available warrior, and he would destroy the Khwarezmian Empire so thoroughly that it would serve as an eternal lesson about the consequences of insulting the Mongol Khan. The decision was not made in hot blood or rage. It was calculated, strategic. The Khwarezmian Empire had shown itself to be arrogant and foolish, qualities that made it both dangerous and vulnerable. Dangerous because it might inspire other kingdoms to similar disrespect. Vulnerable because such arrogance suggested internal weakness, a failure to properly assess the threat the Mongols represented. As Genghis Khan prepared his forces, he gathered intelligence through an extensive spy network that had been operating along the Silk Road for years. Merchants, travelers, and defectors provided detailed information about Khwarezmian military strength, internal politics, terrain, and city defenses. The intelligence revealed promising weaknesses. Shah Muhammad and his mother Turkan Khatun were locked in a power struggle, dividing the empire's leadership. The army was large but poorly coordinated. Most critically, the Shah had decided on a defensive strategy, dispersing his forces across many cities rather than concentrating them for a decisive battle. The Mongol army that assembled for the Khwarezmian campaign numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, though exact figures remain disputed by historians. What is certain is that it was organized with unprecedented efficiency. Unlike his earlier raids into Jin territory, this invasion force included substantial siege equipment and engineering units staffed by Chinese and other conquered specialists. The Mongols were no longer just raiders. They had become a combined arms force capable of taking the strongest fortifications. 7. A world in flames. In autumn 1219, the Mongol armies crossed the Tian Shan mountains and entered Khwarezmian territory. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns, each commanded by trusted generals or his sons. The strategy was to strike simultaneously at multiple points, preventing the Shah from coordinating an effective response. Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, led forces down the Darya River, taking cities one by one as he advanced toward the capital, Gurganj. Chagatai and Ugadai besieged Otrar with 20,000 men, focusing on the city where the original massacre had occurred. Genghis Khan himself, with his youngest son Tolui, took a route that the Khwarezmians considered impossible, directly across the Kizilkum Desert, one of the most inhospitable regions in Central Asia. Wikasis of the desert was a masterpiece of logistics and deception. The Khwarezmians expected attacks from predictable directions, through mountain passes and along river valleys. Instead, Genghis Khan's main force appeared suddenly before the walls of Bukhara, one of the jewels of the Silk Road, having marched through terrain that should have been impassable for an army. The siege of Bukhara began in February 1220. The city's garrison attempted to break out, but was massacred in open battle. When the city leaders opened the gates to avoid further bloodshed, the Mongols entered and methodically organized the city's surrender. Genghis Khan reportedly gathered the city's wealthy merchants and religious leaders in a mosque and lectured them about their Shah's foolishness in provoking the Mongols. What happened next at Bukhara has been the subject of much historical debate. Sources agree that much of the city was destroyed by fire, but they disagree on whether this was deliberate Mongol policy or an accident during looting. Artisans and craftsmen were spared and sent to Mongolia, as Genghis Khan valued skilled workers. Young men were conscripted into the Mongol army to serve as laborers and shields in future sieges. The city's wealth was systematically plundered and distributed according to Mongol law. From Bukhara, Genghis Khan marched on Samarkand, the Khwarezmian capital, and perhaps the greatest city in Central Asia at that time. Samarkand had walls, a large garrison, variously estimated between 40,000 and 110,000 men, and every reason to believe it could withstand a siege. But Genghis Khan's sons, Chagatai and Ugadai, had by now finished reducing Otrar and joined him with their forces, creating an overwhelming numerical advantage. Phantom. The siege of Samarkand lasted only 5 days. On the third day, the garrison attempted a massive sortie, hoping to break the siege through sheer force. Genghis Khan had anticipated this and prepared a classic feigned retreat, one of the Mongols' favorite tactics. The garrison forces, thinking they had broken the Mongol ranks, pursued too far and found themselves surrounded. Approximately half the garrison was annihilated in the open field. The remaining defenders, seeing their best troops destroyed, surrendered. The terms were brutal but clear. Those who surrendered immediately would be spared enslavement, though they would have to pay heavy tribute. Those who had resisted would face execution or slavery. The city's artisans were again separated out and sent to Mongolia. The Muslim religious leaders were largely spared and allowed to continue their practices, demonstrating Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance even amidst conquest. Conquered. But where was Shah Muhammad during all this, the ruler who had begun this catastrophe by refusing to apologize for Otrar's governor? He was fleeing, abandoning city after city, unable to coordinate a defense, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Genghis Khan sent 2 of his best generals, Jebe and Subutai, with 20,000 cavalry to pursue the Shah across Persia, Armenia, and beyond. It became one of the great military campaigns of history, a reconnaissance in force that would take the Mongols into regions they had never seen before. Shah Muhammad fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died a broken man, possibly from illness, in 1220. His death solved nothing for the Khwarezmians. His son, Jalal al-Din, braver and more capable than his father, attempted to organize resistance, but by then the Mongol armies had scattered his potential allies and devastated the empire's heartland. The siege of Gurganj, the northern capital where Jochi was in command, proved particularly difficult. The city had excellent fortifications and a determined garrison. The siege lasted 4 to 7 months, with bitter house-to-house fighting. When the city finally fell, the destruction was thorough. The irrigation systems that had made Gurganj prosperous were destroyed, turning a once thriving city into a near wasteland. One city in particular witnessed horrors that were extreme even by the brutal standards of Mongol warfare. Merv, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, resisted despite knowing what had happened elsewhere. When it fell in 1221, the Mongols methodically exterminated the population. Sources vary wildly on the numbers, from several 100,000 to over 1 million dead, but all agree that it was one of the deadliest captures of a city in human history. Why such brutality? Some scholars argue it was pure terror tactics, making resistance so costly that other cities would surrender rather than face similar fates. Others suggest that the Mongols, with relatively small armies conquering vast territories, could not afford to leave hostile populations behind them. Still others point to the Mongol code of warfare. Cities that surrendered immediately would be treated mercifully, but those that resisted would face the full wrath of the Mongol armies as both punishment and warning. Kanj 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire had effectively ceased to exist. The great cities were ruins or under Mongol control. The Shah was dead, his son fleeing from province to province. Genghis Khan had accomplished in less than 2 years what had seemed impossible, the complete conquest of one of the world's great empires. But the campaign had lessons beyond mere military victory. The Mongols had now absorbed thousands of skilled administrators, engineers, scholars, and craftsmen from a sophisticated Islamic civilization. They had gained control of the central portions of the Silk Road, the trade routes connecting east and west. They had demonstrated to the entire Muslim world and beyond that the Mongols were not merely raiders but conquerors, capable of destroying the mightiest kingdoms. 8. The Empire Builder. Genghis Khan returned from the Khwarezmian campaign not just as a successful military commander, but as the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in history. He now controlled territory stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from Siberia to northern India. But conquest is easier than governance, and the great Khan understood that holding this empire required more than military might. The Yasa law code, which Genghis Khan had begun developing when first unifying the Mongol tribes, now expanded to govern a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire spanning thousands of miles. The code itself was kept secret, known only to Mongol nobility and certain key administrators, giving the ruling class flexibility in interpretation while maintaining the appearance of unchanging divine law. Some provisions of the Yasa dealt with military discipline and organization. Warriors who fled in battle faced execution, as did those who failed to help a companion in combat. Loyalty to the Khan and the empire took precedence over all other loyalties, including family. Cowardice was punished by death. Courage was rewarded with promotion and wealth. Ultimo provisions addressed civilian life. Theft was punishable by death, even for minor offenses, creating an atmosphere where a purse of gold could be left on a road and remain untouched for days. Murder, adultery, and kidnapping all carried capital sentences. Religious leaders of all faiths were exempted from taxation and military service, promoting tolerance and preventing religious conflicts within the empire. Perhaps most revolutionary was the Yasa's emphasis on meritocracy. Genghis Khan had experienced firsthand how destructive the traditional aristocratic system could be. He had grown up outside the ruling elite and had suffered for it. Now, as supreme leader, he institutionalized a different approach. Promotion was based on ability and loyalty, not bloodline. A shepherd could become a general if he proved his worth. Foreign specialists were welcomed into service regardless of their origins. Sluggish, this openness to talent from any source gave the Mongol Empire access to expertise from all the civilizations it conquered or contacted. Chinese advisors helped organize taxation systems. Persian administrators maintained records and correspondence. Muslim engineers designed irrigation projects. Christian scholars from Europe brought knowledge of distant lands. The Mongol court became a melting pot of cultures, united by service to the Khan and by the opportunities the empire provided. Trade flourished under Mongol rule in ways unprecedented in history. The Pax Mongolica, as historians later called it, secured the Silk Road from end to end under a single authority for the first time. Merchants traveling with proper documents received protection from the Mongol state. Bandits and local warlords who might have preyed on caravans were eliminated or subordinated. Customs duties were standardized and reduced. Way stations called yam were established every 25 to 30 miles along major routes, providing fresh horses and supplies for official messengers and protected merchants. The economic impact was transformative. Goods from China, silks, porcelain, tea, spices, flowed westward in greater quantities than ever before. Persian and Arab goods, carpets, glass, precious metals, moved eastward. Ideas traveled with the goods, mathematical concepts from India, astronomical observations from Muslim scholars, technical innovations from China. The Mongol Empire became a conduit for cultural and technological exchange on a scale that would not be matched until the age of global maritime trade centuries later. Genghis Khan also established an extensive intelligence and communication network. The YAM system served military purposes as well as commercial ones. Mounted couriers could ride from one end of the empire to the other, carrying messages at speeds impossible in earlier eras. Fresh horses at each station meant couriers could maintain punishing paces. This gave Genghis Khan unprecedented ability to monitor his empire, to respond to threats, and to coordinate military operations across vast distances. Rukavod tolerance, a cornerstone of Genghis Khan's policy, was not based on modern notions of pluralism, but on practical politics. The Mongols had their traditional shamanic beliefs, venerating the eternal blue sky and various nature spirits. But Genghis Khan recognized that his empire contained Buddhists, Muslims, Christians of various sects, Taoists, and followers of many other faiths. Attempting to impose religious uniformity would provoke endless rebellions. Better to allow freedom of worship, tax the religious institutions minimally, and demand only political loyalty. This policy attracted support from religious minorities persecuted elsewhere. Christians in Muslim lands and Muslims in Christian lands saw the Mongol Empire as relatively tolerant by the standards of the time. The policy also allowed Genghis Khan to manipulate religious politics, playing different factions against each other when necessary, while maintaining the appearance of impartiality. Yet for all his administrative innovations and relatively enlightened policies on religious tolerance and meritocracy, Genghis Khan remained fundamentally a warrior ruler. He understood power flowed from military strength, and he never allowed his armies to grow soft. Regular campaigns kept warriors sharp and provided opportunities for young men to prove themselves. Even in peacetime, mock battles and hunting expeditions maintained military readiness. The hunting expeditions in particular served multiple purposes. They trained warriors in tactics and coordination. They reinforced social bonds within military units. They demonstrated the Khan's leadership in traditional nomadic activities. And they brought impressive amounts of game meat to feed the armies and court. These great hunts could involve tens of thousands of men encircling regions of hundreds of square miles, driving all animals toward the center where the Khan would have the first shot. 9. Succession and shadows. As Genghis Khan aged, the question of succession loomed larger. He had many children, legitimate and illegitimate, from his various wives and concubines. But Mongol tradition held that only the sons of his first wife, Borte, could inherit the Khanship. This meant 4 candidates: Jochi, Chagatai, Urgedei, and Tolui. Jochi, the eldest, should have been the heir by traditional succession rules, but the cloud over his paternity had never dissipated. Chagatai, the second son, openly questioned whether Jochi was truly Genghis Khan's son or the spawn of a murkit rapist. The two brothers barely restrained their mutual hatred, and their rivalry poisoned any hope of a smooth succession. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the succession crisis came to a head during a family meeting. Genghis Khan asked his sons to discuss who should succeed him. Chagatai immediately objected to Jochi, calling him a murkit bastard and unfit to rule. The two brothers nearly came to blows before being separated. Genghis Khan sat silent through this confrontation, neither defending Jochi's legitimacy nor condemning Chagatai's accusations. Finally, Ögedei, the third son, was suggested as a compromise candidate. He was known for his even temper, his generosity, and his administrative abilities. Both Jochi and Chagatai agreed to support Ögedei rather than continue their destructive feud. Genghis Khan confirmed the decision. Ögedei would be the next great Khan. But Genghis Khan's relationship with Jochi remained troubled. After the Khwarezmian campaign, Jochi was given control of the westernmost territories of the empire, lands that would become the Golden Horde under his descendants. Some historians argue this was a generous grant, giving Jochi his own realm to rule. Others suggest it was exile, removing a problematic heir from proximity to power and placing him on the empire's distant frontier. The rift between father and eldest son deepened over time. Jochi grew increasingly independent, sometimes ignoring commands from the Khan. Rumors circulated that he was building an independent power base, preparing to rebel. Whether these rumors were true or paranoid fantasies remains unclear. What is known is that Jochi died in 1225, possibly from injuries sustained in a hunting accident, possibly from illness. Some later sources, considered less reliable, suggest he was assassinated on Genghis Khan's orders, though most historians dismiss this as unlikely. The succession settled, Genghis Khan turned his attention to his final campaign. The western Xia, which had submitted as a vassal state years earlier, had refused to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign when requested. This was both a violation of their tributary obligations and a dangerous signal that other vassals might ignore Mongol demands if left unpunished. At the age of 65, Genghis Khan would personally lead an army against the Tanguts. The campaign began in 1226 and proceeded with the methodical brutality that had characterized all of Genghis Khan's wars. City after city fell to the Mongols. Resistance was met with annihilation. The Tangut military, despite fighting bravely and using terrain to their advantage, could not stop the Mongol juggernaut. By 1227, the Mongols had isolated the Tangut capital, Yinchuan, and began a siege that would last 6 months. But time was Genghis Khan's enemy now, in a way that no army had ever been. He fell ill during the campaign. The exact nature of his illness remains unknown. Some sources suggest he fell from his horse while hunting and never recovered from internal injuries. Others mention fever consistent with plague or other infectious diseases common in siege environments. Still others point to the general toll of decades of campaigning on an aging body. Genghis Khan knew he was dying. He gave final instructions to his sons and generals. The conquest of Western Xia must be completed. The Jin dynasty must be destroyed. The empire must remain united under Ögedei's leadership. And his death must be kept secret until Western Xia fell, preventing enemies from taking advantage of the transition period. 10. The Great Khan ascends. In August 1227, Genghis Khan died. He was 65 or 67 years old, depending on which birth year historians accept. The circumstances of his death were immediately shrouded in official secrecy. The body was prepared for burial according to Mongol custom, dressed simply as befitted a steppe warrior despite his imperial status. The funeral procession heading back toward Mongolia was, according to legend, marked by systematic killing. Any person or animal encountered on the route was executed to prevent knowledge of the burial location from spreading. Whether this mass killing actually occurred or is exaggeration by terrified chroniclers remains debated. What is certain is that extraordinary measures were taken to conceal where Genghis Khan was laid to rest. The location of his burial site remains one of history's great mysteries. Tradition suggests he was buried near Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain where he had prayed and hidden as a young fugitive. The entire region was declared forbidden, the Ik Korig, or Great Taboo, with trespassing punishable by death. A special tribe called the Dark Had was assigned to guard the area, exempted from all other duties and taxation. Some sources suggest that after burial, thousands of horses were driven over the site to obscure any trace. Others claim a river was diverted to flow over the grave. Still others propose that the burial site is elsewhere entirely, perhaps in the Ordos region, where Genghis Khan died, or in some completely different location. Numerous expeditions over the centuries have searched for the tomb, but none have succeeded. The tomb, if it still exists intact, guards its secret well. Back in Western Xia, the Mongol armies fulfilled Genghis Khan's final command. In September 1227, the Tangut Emperor surrendered. He was promptly executed, and the city of Yinchuan was sacked with particular savagery. The Western Xia dynasty was obliterated so completely that it virtually disappeared from history, its people absorbed into other populations, its cities destroyed or depopulated. It was a final demonstration of the price of defying the Mongols. The empire Genghis Khan left behind was unprecedented in size and scope. It stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to northern India, covering approximately 12 million square miles at his death. Over the next decades, his sons and grandsons would expand it even further. Ögedei would complete the conquest of Jin China. Batu, Jochi's son, would invade Russia and Eastern Europe. Mongke and Kublai, grandsons of Genghis Khan through Tolui, would conquer Song China and establish the Yuan dynasty. Pensions alone does not capture Genghis Khan's significance. He had fundamentally changed the political landscape of Eurasia. He had demonstrated that nomadic peoples, previously dismissed as disorganized barbarians, could build sophisticated empires. He had created systems of law, administration, military organization that would be studied and copied for centuries. He had opened trade routes and encouraged cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Closing. The eternal echo. 8 centuries have passed since Genghis Khan died on that summer day in 1227, yet his shadow still stretches across the modern world. The empire he built with his own hands, forged from the scattered tribes of the Mongolian steppe, touched every corner of Eurasia and left marks that persist to this day. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a startling finding. Approximately 8% of men living in the former territory of the Mongol Empire, and about 0.5% of all men worldwide, share a distinctive Y chromosome signature that traces back approximately 1,000 years to Mongolia. This translates to roughly 16 million living descendants carrying the genetic legacy of Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. The social structure of the Mongol Empire, where the ruling family had access to multiple wives and concubines across vast territories, created conditions for this unprecedented genetic spread. But Genghis Khan's legacy extends far beyond genetics. The Pax Mongolica fundamentally transformed trade between East and West. Technologies and ideas that had been confined to specific regions spread across Eurasia. Gunpowder, the compass, printing technology, astronomical observations, mathematical innovations, all moved along Mongol-protected trade routes. The Renaissance in Europe was fueled in part by knowledge that had traveled the Silk Road during the Mongol period. Brightness, the Mongol Empire's religious tolerance, though imperfect by modern standards, was remarkable for its time. In an era when European kingdoms were expelling Jews and burning heretics, when Muslim caliphates enforced strict religious conformity, the Mongol Empire allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others to practice their faiths freely, as long as they submitted politically. This created pockets of diversity that influenced later policies in successor states. The military innovations Genghis Khan pioneered, the emphasis on mobility, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and combined arms tactics, influenced military thinking for centuries. European armies studied Mongol tactics. The Japanese still remember the Mongol invasions as the kamikaze, the divine wind that supposedly destroyed the invasion fleets. The Russians, conquered by the Golden Horde and ruled by Mongol descendants for over 2 centuries, incorporated many Mongol administrative practices into their own governance. Yet for all his achievements, Genghis Khan's legacy remains deeply controversial. He was responsible for the deaths of millions. Entire cities were destroyed. Civilizations were traumatized by the violence of Mongol conquest. The demographic impact was catastrophic in some regions, with population levels taking generations to recover. The pyramids of skulls, the wholesale slaughter of resistors, the systematic use of terror, these were not propaganda by enemies, but documented historical facts. Modern assessments of Genghis Khan reflect this duality. In Mongolia, he is revered as the founding father of the nation, the man who united disparate tribes into a powerful people and put Mongolia on the world stage. His face appears on currency, his statues dominate the landscape, and his birth name, Temujin, is one of the most common names given to boys. The pride Mongolians feel in his accomplishments is similar to how Americans view George Washington or French regard Napoleon, a founder figure whose flaws are acknowledged but whose achievements inspire national identity. In other parts of what was once the Mongol Empire, views are more mixed. Some regions remember the Mongol period as a time of prosperity and cultural exchange. Others focus on the devastation and loss. The Middle East particularly has long memories of cities like Baghdad and Merv destroyed by Mongol armies. Yet even there, historians acknowledge that the Mongol invasions, however brutal, created conditions that led to new political formations and cultural developments. Western historians have struggled to categorize Genghis Khan. Is he a genocidal conqueror, a brilliant military commander, a visionary administrator, an enlightened ruler, or some combination of all these? The answer likely depends on perspective and what aspects of his legacy one emphasizes. He was certainly all of these things at different times and in different contexts. What is undeniable is his historical significance. Few individuals have so profoundly shaped the course of human civilization. He built the largest contiguous land empire in history. He connected East and West in ways that had never been achieved before and would not be matched until the age of European maritime exploration. He demonstrated that nomadic societies could build sophisticated empires. He created administrative and legal systems that governed effectively across vast distances and diverse populations. The man who was born Temujin, who grew up as an orphan surviving on the margins of society, who was enslaved, who starved, who built himself up through will and intelligence and ruthless determination. This man became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the oceanic sovereign. His story is a testament to what one individual can achieve through vision, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. As the sun sets over the grasslands of Mongolia, where horses still run free and the wind carries the same songs it carried 800 years ago, the spirit of Genghis Khan lingers. Not in any tomb that archaeologists might someday discover, not in the genetic markers that prove his prolific legacy, but in the very idea that the world can be transformed by those determined enough to seize it, that empires can rise from nothing, that history is made by those who refuse to accept the limits others place on them. The boy born clutching a blood clot did indeed become a great conqueror, but more than that, he became eternal. His name will be remembered as long as humans study history, debate the costs and benefits of conquest, wonder at the rise and fall of empires, and dream of leaving their own mark on the world. Temujin of the Borjigin clan, Genghis Khan, the Great Khan, the conqueror who rode from the edge of the Pacific to the shores of the Mediterranean, who made the earth tremble beneath the hooves of his horses, who built an empire that spanned half the known world, has achieved a form of immortality that no monument could provide. His legacy is written in genetics, in historical records, in the very geography of Eurasia, in the cultural exchanges his empire facilitated, in the military tactics that bear his influence, in the nations that trace their origins to his conquests. 8 centuries after his death, Genghis Khan remains what he always was, a force of nature made human, a testament to the terrifying and awesome potential of human will unleashed upon the world. Bisexual mountain Burkhan Khaldun still stands, still guards its secret, still looks down upon the grasslands where a new generation of Mongols ride and dream. Somewhere in those mountains, perhaps, lies the body of the man who changed everything. But his spirit, his legacy, his impact on human civilization, these need no tomb. They are written in the very fabric of our world, eternal and undeniable. The mark of a man who refused to accept the world as it was and instead remade it in his image. That is the legend. That is the reality. That is Genghis Khan. This narrative draws from extensive historical sources, including the secret history of the Mongols, Persian chroniclers such as Rashid al-Din and Juzjani, Chinese records from the Yuan Shi and other sources, and modern historical scholarship. Where sources conflict, the most commonly accepted interpretations have been presented. Some sources claim that certain events occurred in slightly different years or circumstances, reflecting the challenges of reconstructing events from 800 years ago across multiple languages and cultures.